Officer Daniel Grayson adjusted his uniform as he stepped out of his patrol car, the weight of his badge heavy on his chest. He had spent years on the force, patrolling the same neighborhoods, making the same arrests. Black men and women were always suspects in his eyes, criminals waiting to be caught. It wasn't about justice, it was about control. The system backed him, the courts believed him, and no one questioned his authority. Today was no different. As he drove through the city, his eyes landed on a black woman stepping out of a luxury car. Something about her irritated him. Dr. Ayanna Caldwell barely noticed the police cruiser slowing beside her as she adjusted the strap of her leather bag. Her mind was preoccupied with the briefing she had just left, another meeting on police accountability, another attempt to fix a broken system. She had spent years working within the justice system, climbing ranks despite the odds stacked against her. But she knew change was slow. As she locked her car, she heard a voice behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am. Step aside." She turned to see Officer Grayson, his stance authoritative, his eyes sharp with suspicion. "Is there a problem, officer?" Ayanna asked, her voice calm but firm. Grayson smirked, his eyes scanning her car, then settling on her. "I need to see some ID. Looks like you're in a stolen vehicle." Ayanna let out a soft breath, already familiar with how this would go. "This is my car. Registered in my name. You can run the plates." Grayson tilted his head, his smirk deepening. He had done this before. He knew how to push buttons, how to make people nervous, how to make them slip up. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Ayanna didn't move. "You have no probable cause." Grayson narrowed his eyes. "Resisting, huh? Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Before she could respond, he grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back. Ayanna winced, but she refused to show pain. She had seen this happen to others too many times. Now, it was happening to her. "You're under arrest," Grayson said, cuffing her. "For what?" she demanded. "Fraud. Grand theft auto. Resisting an officer." A small crowd gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some pulled out their phones, recording. But Grayson wasn't worried. He had arrested plenty of black people before, faced public outcry, and still kept his job. The system protected him. Ayanna remained silent as he put her in the back of his cruiser. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from anger. He had no idea who she was. At the station, Grayson processed her like any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshot, paperwork filled with false accusations. He didn't ask questions. He didn't care. He assumed she was another nobody, another face in the system. He arranged for her court hearing, confident she'd be another statistic. The next morning, he walked into the courtroom, feeling triumphant. He had done his job. But as soon as he entered, the atmosphere shifted. The judge, the attorneys, everyone looked uneasy. Grayson frowned, then turned to see Ayanna Caldwell standing at the front of the courtroom, her cuffs removed, her stance powerful. Judge Thompson cleared his throat. "Officer Grayson, do you know who you just arrested?" Grayson blinked, confused. "A suspect, Your Honor." A quiet chuckle spread through the room. Judge Thompson shook his head. "Dr. Ayanna Caldwell is the state's chief prosecutor for police misconduct. And as of now, you are the one on trial." A cold sweat broke out on Officer Grayson's forehead as murmurs spread through the courtroom. He felt the weight of every eye in the room shifting onto him, the confident grip he had on the situation slipping fast. His mind raced. How could this be? He had arrested countless black people, and it had always been their word against his. The system never questioned him. But now, standing before a woman whose rank dwarfed his, the rules had changed. His throat tightened as Ayanna turned to face him fully, her eyes filled not with anger, but with something worse, certainty. Ayanna stepped forward, smoothing her blazer with slow precision. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to address the circumstances of my arrest," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "Officer Grayson claimed I was driving a stolen vehicle. He refused to check my registration, ignored my right to question probable cause, and proceeded to arrest me on fabricated charges." She turned to Grayson, her gaze unwavering. "Unfortunately for you, officer, my entire encounter with you was recorded, both by civilians and by the surveillance cameras outside the courthouse. Shall we review the footage?" Grayson's pulse pounded in his ears. He had handled enough cases to know this was a setup he wouldn't escape easily. His mind scrambled for a way out. Maybe if he apologized, no, that would be an admission of guilt. Maybe if he denied everything, no, the footage would contradict him. He glanced at his attorney, who sat stiffly beside him, already taking notes. This wasn't going to be a slap on the wrist. This was the beginning of something much worse. His badge suddenly felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Judge Thompson sighed heavily, adjusting his glasses. Roll the footage. A large screen flickered to life at the front of the courtroom. The entire room fell silent as the video played. There it was, clear as day. Ayanna standing beside her car, her tone composed, her demeanor professional. And then Grayson, smirking, ignoring her request to check the registration, grabbing her wrist with unnecessary force. His voice, filled with arrogance, echoed through the courtroom as he listed false charges. The video ended with him shoving her into the cruiser, the camera capturing the cold indifference in his eyes. A heavy silence followed. The judge exhaled sharply. "Officer Grayson, do you have anything to say?" Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it again. He felt the eyes of his fellow officers in the courtroom, some looking away in discomfort, others watching intently. His reputation, his power, had always come from the belief that his word was law. But now, standing before a woman who understood the law better than he ever would, he realized he was trapped. He swallowed hard. "Your Honor, I was acting in good faith." The suspect. Ayanna interrupted. "You mean me? The chief prosecutor for police misconduct? Or just another black person you assumed was a criminal?" Murmurs erupted again. Judge Thompson banged his gavel for order. "Enough." He turned his sharp gaze to Grayson. "Officer, do you understand the severity of what you've done?" Grayson's jaw clenched. "I was doing my job." "No," Ayanna countered. "You were abusing your power." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, this is not an isolated incident. Officer Grayson has a record of excessive force and wrongful arrests, disproportionately targeting black citizens. I have files of complaints lodged against him, cases dismissed, voices silenced. But not today." Grayson stiffened. "Lies," he muttered under his breath. Ayanna's lips pressed together. "Would you like me to pull up the reports?" "Because I can." The judge nodded. "I'd like to see them." Ayanna handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. He flipped through the pages, his frown deepening. "Officer Grayson, this file is extensive, complaints from multiple victims, all following the same pattern. You never faced consequences because you knew how to work the system. But it seems your time has run out." Grayson's hands curled into fists at his sides. "This is a witch hunt." "No," Ayanna said, stepping closer. "This is accountability." Grayson's lawyer finally spoke, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a private hearing for my client before any formal charges are considered." Ayanna scoffed. "Funny. Did any of the people he falsely accused get private hearings before they were thrown into a jail cell?" The judge sighed. "Enough grandstanding. Officer Grayson, you will be temporarily relieved of duty while an independent investigation is conducted." Grayson's stomach dropped. "What?" "You're lucky you're not in cuffs," the judge said coldly. Ayanna turned to leave, but before she did, she looked at Grayson one last time. "This isn't over," she said. And deep down, Grayson knew she was right. Grayson stood frozen as the judge's words echoed in his ears. Temporarily relieved of duty? The words felt like a slap. His entire career, he had wielded his badge like a shield, untouchable, unquestioned. But now, for the first time, he felt powerless. His fellow officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering among themselves. He had been their golden boy, the one who got things done. But now, he was a liability. His hands clenched at his sides as he watched Ayanna gather her things. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't gloating. And that infuriated him even more. Outside the courtroom, Ayanna exhaled slowly. She had faced corruption before, seen officers like Grayson manipulate the system. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the way the courtroom had shifted, the way people had actually listened. Change was slow, but maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. It was an email from her office. More complaints about Grayson were pouring in, people emboldened to speak now that someone had finally stood up to him. She sighed. This was far from over. But she was ready for the fight. Grayson stormed out of the courthouse, his lawyer trailing behind him. You need to lay low, the man advised. Let me handle the media. The department will want to distance themselves from this. Grayson's jaw tightened. Distance themselves? I've done everything by the book. They can't just throw me under the bus. His lawyer gave him a look. You and I both know that's not true. Grayson turned away, his hands curling into fists. He wasn't going to let some woman, no matter how high-ranking, take him down. He had connections, people who owed him favors. He wasn't finished. Not yet. Meanwhile, Ayanna arrived at her office to find her team waiting for her. More people are coming forward, one of her investigators said. Victims, witnesses, even a few officers who don't want to be part of Grayson's mess. Ayanna nodded. Good. Build the case. We don't just want him off the force. We want him held accountable. Her assistant hesitated. There's something else. Grayson's been making calls. He's looking for a way out. Ayanna sighed. She had expected this. Then we need to move fast. That evening, Grayson sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through the news on his phone. His name was everywhere. Some headlines painted him as a corrupt cop finally getting what he deserved. Others defended him, claiming he was the victim of a political agenda. He scoffed. The media would spin it however they wanted. He just needed to control the narrative. He dialed a number. Yeah, a gruff voice answered. I need a favor, Grayson said. You still got people in internal affairs? A pause. Then, depends. What do you need? Something on Ayanna Caldwell. Anything. Find me a reason to take her down. The next morning, Ayanna's team met again. We've got enough to recommend formal charges, her lead investigator said. But there's a problem. Someone's been digging into your past. Ayanna arched a brow. Let me guess, Grayson? Her investigator nodded. It's getting ugly. They're trying to discredit you. Ayanna sighed, rubbing her temples. She had expected pushback, but this was fast. Let them dig, she said. I have nothing to hide. Grayson smirked as he read the file sent to him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to raise questions. A case Ayanna had prosecuted years ago, one with a controversial outcome. He knew how the public worked. They didn't need proof, just enough doubt. He forwarded the file to a journalist he knew would run with it. That night, Ayanna's face appeared on the news, not for her work against Grayson, but for a case from her past. The anchors speculated about her ethics, her judgment. The comments online were brutal. Some called her corrupt, others questioned if she was any better than Grayson. She took a deep breath. She had been here before. She could handle this. But her phone rang, and the voice on the other end made her stomach tighten. Ayanna, we need to talk, the mayor said. This is getting out of control. Grayson leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He wasn't out of the fight yet. Ayanna sat in the mayor's office, her back straight, her expression calm. But inside, her mind was racing. She had worked too hard, climbed too high, to let someone like Grayson smear her name. The mayor leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. You know how this works, Ayanna. Perception is everything. If this story gains traction, it could overshadow everything you're trying to do. Ayanna met his gaze. So what are you saying? That I should back down? The mayor sighed. I'm saying be smart. Grayson is desperate. If you push too hard, he'll fight dirty. She already knew that. Meanwhile, Grayson sat in a dimly lit bar, swirling a drink in his hand. Across from him sat a man in a wrinkled suit, one of the few journalists willing to take his side. The pressure's on Caldwell now, the journalist said, checking his phone. People are questioning her. If we dig deeper, we might find something real. Grayson smirked. Or we can make something stick. Doesn't have to be real, just has to last long enough to make her back off. The journalist hesitated, then nodded. What do you have in mind? The next morning, Ayanna's office was flooded with reporters. Questions flew at her from all directions as she stepped into the courthouse. Did you tamper with evidence in the Caldwell case? Are you using your position to cover up your own misconduct? Should you be investigated just like Grayson? She stopped at the top of the courthouse steps, letting the noise settle. Then she spoke, her voice strong and unwavering. I stand by my record. I've spent my career fighting for justice, not abusing it. If anyone wants to investigate me, go ahead. I have nothing to hide. But I promise you this, Officer Grayson will not escape accountability. Inside the courthouse, Ayana's team was waiting. We have a problem, her lead investigator said, shutting the door behind him. Grayson just filed a formal complaint against you. He's claiming you have a personal vendetta and that your case against him is biased. Ayana exhaled slowly. Of course he is. Her assistant hesitated. And he's requesting that the state attorney's office reassign the case to another prosecutor. Ayana clenched her jaw. He's trying to remove me from the case. Grayson sat back in his lawyer's office, a smug look on his face. Caldwell's losing her grip, he said. The moment they pull her off my case, I win. His lawyer sighed. You're playing a dangerous game. If she weathers this, she'll come at you twice as hard. Grayson chuckled. She won't get the chance. That night, Ayana sat alone in her office, staring at the case files spread before her. Grayson was slippery, but she wasn't done fighting. She picked up her phone and dialed a number. It's time, she said. We go public with everything. The next morning, the headlines changed. Victims of Grayson's misconduct started speaking out. Footage of his past arrests surfaced, videos that had been buried, complaints that had been ignored. The narrative was shifting again, this time against him. Grayson woke up to his phone buzzing non-stop. He grabbed it and saw a flood of missed calls. His lawyer, his chief, even some of his old allies. He turned on the news and felt his stomach drop. Caldwell had outmaneuvered him. The walls were closing in. Ayana stepped into her office, her phone still ringing. Her assistant rushed in. The state attorney's office just issued a statement. They're keeping you on the case. A small, triumphant smile tugged at her lips. Good. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Grayson sat in his car, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His phone was still vibrating, calls coming in non-stop, but he ignored them. For the first time in his career, he felt powerless. The weight of his actions, the lives he had disrupted, loomed over him like a storm cloud. He had always believed he was untouchable, that the system would protect him. But now, cracks were forming in the foundation he had stood on for years. And worst of all, the woman he had tried to break was standing taller than ever. Ayana stood at her window, watching the sun rise over the city. Her heart was heavy, but her spirit was unshaken. She had faced challenges before, but this one was personal. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt officer, it was about justice for the voices that had been silenced, for the people who had been cast aside. She thought about every black man and woman who had been falsely accused, who had suffered humiliation and pain at the hands of men like Grayson. This fight wasn't just hers. It belonged to all of them. That morning, Ayana arrived at a community center where victims of Grayson's misconduct had gathered. The room was filled with people, mothers who had watched their sons dragged away in handcuffs, men who had spent nights in jail for crimes they never committed, young women who had been harassed and ignored when they tried to speak up. As she looked into their eyes, she saw pain, anger, but also hope. A hope that, for once, someone was listening. Someone was fighting for them. She cleared her throat, steadying her emotions. I see you, she said. And I won't stop fighting. A young man stepped forward, his hands shaking. He arrested me when I was 16, he said, voice breaking. Said I fit the description of a car thief. I lost a scholarship because of that arrest. It changed my life. An older woman wiped her eyes. My grandson never came home that night. He was just walking from the store, but Grayson said he looked suspicious. He was only 14. Ayana felt her throat tighten. These were not just cases. These were lives. Futures stolen. Dreams shattered. She took a deep breath. We are going to hold him accountable, she promised. But more than that, we are going to change the system. Together. Meanwhile, Grayson sat in his apartment, scrolling through social media. He saw the stories, the faces, the pain. For the first time, he started to wonder, had he ever really seen them before? He had always dismissed complaints against him as people playing the race card, but now, confronted with their raw testimonies, something twisted inside him. Guilt? No. It couldn't be. He had been doing his job, right? His chest tightened as he realized. Maybe he had never truly understood what justice meant. The next day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists lined the walls. Cameras flashed. Ayanna sat at the prosecutor's table, steady and composed. Across from her, Grayson shifted in his seat, his once confident demeanor cracking. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. "We are here today to determine if Officer Grayson will stand trial for misconduct, wrongful arrests, and civil rights violations." The words hung heavy in the air. This was it. The moment where justice would either prevail, or slip away once again. As testimonies were read aloud, Ayanna stole a glance at Grayson. His expression had changed. He no longer looked arrogant, he looked lost. Maybe for the first time, he was beginning to understand the damage he had done. Maybe he was finally seeing the people, not just the arrests. But remorse wasn't enough. Justice had to come first. And she would make sure of it. One by one, victims took the stand. Their voices trembled, but they stood firm. Each testimony was a piece of a larger puzzle, painting a picture of systemic abuse and unchecked power. The judge listened intently, taking notes. Grayson's lawyer objected, tried to dismiss the claims, but the truth was undeniable. Ayanna watched the jury's faces. They weren't just hearing the words, they were feeling them. This was more than a case now. This was a reckoning. When the final testimony was given, the courtroom fell into silence. The judge leaned forward. "Officer Grayson, do you have anything to say?" Grayson swallowed hard. He could deny everything, fight until the bitter end. Or he could face the truth. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse. "I was wrong," he admitted. Gasps rippled through the room. His lawyer tried to interrupt, but he raised a hand. "I abused my power. I hurt people. I don't deserve this badge." Ayanna's heart pounded. She had expected denial, excuses, but not this. The judge studied him carefully. "Are you admitting guilt?" Grayson looked at Ayanna. For the first time he truly saw her, not as an enemy, but as a woman who had fought for justice even when the odds were against her. His gaze dropped. "Yes." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Ayanna exhaled, steadying herself. This wasn't victory, not yet. But it was a step. The judge nodded. "Then we proceed to trial." The fight wasn't over. But justice was closer than it had ever been. Grayson sat in the holding cell, staring at the cold concrete walls. He had never been on this side before, never felt the weight of a system designed to punish, never experienced the suffocating fear of not knowing what came next. For years, he had dismissed the cries of the people he arrested, believing they deserved it. Now, stripped of his badge, his power, and his reputation, he finally understood. This wasn't just about laws. This was about humanity. And he had failed. He buried his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt truly alone. Ayanna sat in her office, staring at the case files spread before her. She had fought for justice before, but this case was different. This time, she wasn't just seeking punishment, she was seeking change. She thought about Grayson, about the people he had wronged, about the system that had allowed him to thrive for so long. Justice wasn't just about making him pay. It was about making sure this never happened again. Her phone buzzed. It was one of the young men who had testified. "Thank you," his message read. "For the first time, I feel seen." The trial began, and the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, victims, activists, journalists, officers. The air was thick with emotion, but Ayanna stayed focused. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about truth. As she presented her case, she spoke with power and grace. "This is not just about one officer," she told the jury. "This is about a system that allowed him to operate unchecked. This is about the lives that were stolen, the futures that were ruined. This is about justice. Not just for today, but for generations to come." One by one, the victims testified again. Some wept. Some spoke with quiet fury. Others struggled to find the words. But each voice carried weight. Each story was a brick in the wall of truth that was being built. Ayanna watched as members of the jury shifted uncomfortably, as even Grayson's lawyer seemed to falter. The truth was undeniable. The system had failed. The people had been betrayed. And now, The world was watching. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a movement. A demand for something better. Something fair. Something just. Then, something unexpected happened. Grayson's lawyer called him to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. No one expected him to testify. No one expected him to speak. He walked slowly, his once confident posture now heavy with the weight of his choices. He took a deep breath and met Ayana's gaze. "I was wrong," he said again. But this time, his voice was stronger. "I abused my power. I destroyed lives. And for a long time, I refused to see it. But I see it now." Gasps filled the room. Even Ayana was taken aback. She had expected him to fight, to deny. Instead, he was admitting his guilt before the entire court. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, but Grayson continued. "I know an apology isn't enough," he said, voice breaking. "I know that nothing I say can undo the pain I've caused. But I'm done hiding behind excuses. I need to face the consequences. And I need to change." Tears welled in the eyes of some victims. Others watched him with skepticism, unwilling to believe his words. But Ayana saw something different. She saw sincerity. After the trial adjourned for the day, Ayana stepped outside into the cool air. She had fought so many battles in her life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about winning. It was about healing. As she walked to her car, she heard a voice behind her. "Ms. Coldwell." She turned to see Grayson's wife standing there, her eyes filled with emotion. "I don't expect you to care," she said softly, "but, thank you." He's seeing himself for the first time. "And it's because of you." Ayana felt a lump in her throat. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about transformation. The next day in court, the prosecution rested its case. The jury deliberated, and tension filled the room. People braced for the verdict. When the judge returned, the air was thick with anticipation. On the charges of misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations, this court finds Officer Grayson guilty. A moment of silence, then an eruption of emotion. Some cried. Some cheered. Some simply sat in stunned silence. Ayana closed her eyes, exhaling deeply. Justice had been served. But the work wasn't over. The fight for true reform was just beginning. Grayson remained still as the verdict settled over him. He had expected rage, denial, maybe even despair. But instead, he felt something strange, relief. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding behind his badge. He wasn't pretending. He was simply facing the truth. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward redemption. As the guards led him away, he turned to Ayana. Their eyes met for a brief moment. He nodded once. Not in defiance, not in anger, but in understanding. She had fought for justice. And in some strange way, she had saved him too. A week later, Ayana stood before a crowd at a community event. Families of victims, activists, even some officers who wanted change had gathered. "This isn't just about one trial," she told them. "This is about building a future where no one has to fear the system that was meant to protect them. This is about accountability, about fairness, about justice that truly serves all people." Applause rippled through the crowd, but more than that, she saw hope in their eyes. Real hope. Change was possible. And she wasn't done fighting. Not now. Not ever. As the sun set over the city, Ayana stood at the courthouse steps, looking out at the people who had fought alongside her. The young man who had lost his scholarship, the grandmother who had mourned her grandson's wrongful arrest, the officers who had chosen justice over blind loyalty. They had all played a part in this moment. She felt tears well up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of something else. Something deeper. "We did it," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, she truly believed that the world could be different. Days passed, but the weight of victory still sat heavily on Ayana's shoulders. Justice had been served, yet she knew the wounds left behind wouldn't heal overnight. Change was slow, and trust was fragile. The people who had been harmed by the system, who had been humiliated, falsely accused, and stripped of their dignity, needed more than just a guilty verdict. They needed to believe in the future. They needed proof that things would be different. Ayana had spent her entire life fighting for justice, but now she realized, winning the case was only the beginning of something much bigger. One evening, she sat in her office, going through letters from the community. Some thanked her, others shared their pain, and some simply asked, "What's next?" The question haunted her. What was next? She couldn't just walk away after one case, one victory. There were still people suffering, still officers abusing their power, still laws that needed to be changed. Then, she saw a letter that made her pause. It was from the young man who had lost his scholarship because of Grayson's false arrest. "I want to fight too," he had written. "Tell me how." The next day, Ayanna met with community leaders, activists, and even officers who wanted to see change from within. "We need policies in place," she said. "Stronger oversight, real accountability, training that isn't just a formality but a transformation." One officer, a black woman who had worked in the department for years, nodded. "It's time we stop protecting the wrong people and start protecting the right ones." Ayanna looked around the room, seeing something powerful: unity. People who once stood on opposite sides were coming together. It was proof that change wasn't just possible. It was happening. Meanwhile, Grayson sat in prison, grappling with the consequences of his actions. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. No badge. No authority. Just another man behind bars. And yet, as days turned into weeks, he found himself listening to the stories of the men around him, to the pain he had once ignored. He heard the anger, the injustice, the heartbreak. And he realized something he had never considered before. He had been part of the problem for so long, but maybe, just maybe, he could be part of the solution too. One afternoon, he was approached by an older inmate, a man who had been wrongfully convicted years ago. "Funny, isn't it?" the man said. "You put people like me in here, and now you're on the other side." Grayson didn't argue. "I deserve this," he admitted. The man studied him, then nodded. "Maybe. But if you're serious about change, you've got work to do." Grayson felt something stir in him. He had spent his life tearing people down. Could he now spend the rest of it building them up? He didn't know the answer, but he wanted to try. Back in the city, Ayanna was working harder than ever. She helped push for new laws, body cameras that couldn't be turned off at an officer's convenience, independent investigations for police misconduct, community-led oversight boards. The resistance was strong, but so was she. One night, she received a call from Grayson's wife. "I know he doesn't deserve your kindness," she said hesitantly. "But he's changing. He's trying. And I think it's because of you." Ayanna didn't respond right away. Justice had been served, but was there room for redemption too? She had always believed in second chances, for the right people. Months passed, and Ayanna's work continued to reshape the system. People who once feared speaking up now had a voice. Young men who had been wrongfully arrested found their records cleared. Grayson's case became a turning point, forcing police departments across the country to re-evaluate their practices. Then one day, Ayanna received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was familiar. She hesitated before opening it. Inside it read, "I will never undo the pain I caused. But I'm learning. And I'm listening. Thank you for making me see. Grayson." She exhaled, setting the letter down. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. But she knew that if people like him could change, then maybe there was hope for the system after all. That evening, she walked through the community where she had once been arrested. But this time, she wasn't in handcuffs. This time, she was welcomed with open arms. Children ran up to her, women shook her hand, young men looked at her with respect. One mother, holding her child, whispered, "Because of you, my son won't have to grow up afraid." Ayanna swallowed hard. This was why she fought. One night, at a community meeting, the young man who had lost his scholarship stood up. "I was angry for a long time," he said. "Angry at Grayson, angry at the system. But Ms. Caldwell showed me something. Anger isn't enough. We have to build something better." Ayanna watched as the room nodded in agreement. Change wasn't about one person. It was about all of them, working together. As the meeting ended, the young man approached her. "I'm applying for law school," he said. "Because of you." Tears stung her eyes. Justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about inspiring others. As the months turned into a year, Ayanna's work became a national movement. Other cities followed her lead, implementing reforms that once seemed impossible. She was invited to speak at universities, to advise on policy changes, to train young lawyers who wanted to fight for justice. And every time she stood before a crowd, she told them the same thing: we cannot undo the past. But we can shape the future. And if we fight together, if we believe in justice, if we refuse to be silent, then the world will change. And it will be because of us. One day, she returned to the courtroom where she had fought her biggest battle. She stood outside, staring up at the building that had once held her fate in its hands. A young black officer walked past, tipping his hat. "Ms. Caldwell," he said respectfully. "Because of you, I wear this badge differently." She smiled, her heart swelling. The world wasn't perfect yet. There was still work to do. But she had planted a seed. And one day, that seed would grow into something even greater than she had ever imagined. The fight for justice was far from over. But hope? Hope was stronger than ever. Ayanna sat at her desk, staring at a framed picture of her late father. He had been her biggest inspiration, always reminding her that justice was not just about punishment but about transformation. "You can't change the past," he had once told her. "But you can build a future where fewer people suffer." She exhaled, thinking about how far she had come. She had fought a battle many thought was impossible, and yet, here she was, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And she was prepared to keep walking. The community had changed, too. Conversations about police reform weren't whispered in fear anymore. They were loud, powerful, and impossible to ignore. Young men who once avoided officers now sat at town halls, demanding accountability. Families who had lost loved ones to wrongful arrests found comfort in knowing their pain had led to change. But there was still work to be done. Ayanna knew that one victory wouldn't fix everything. Corruption still lurked in the shadows. Racism still hid behind policies. But something had shifted. People believed in change now. And that belief was the most powerful weapon of all. One evening, as she left her office, she saw a familiar face waiting for her. Grayson's wife. "I don't want to take much of your time," she said hesitantly. "But I wanted you to know, he's doing something different." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" The woman swallowed. "He's been mentoring young men in prison, telling them to never end up like him. He's writing about his mistakes. He's trying to help, in his own way." Ayanna wasn't sure how to respond. She had fought so hard against him. And yet, somehow, even he had found a way to change. Weeks later, Ayanna received an invitation to speak at a prison rehabilitation program. When she arrived, she was surprised to see Grayson standing at the podium, addressing a room full of inmates. He looked different, less like the arrogant officer she had once known and more like a man who had been broken and rebuilt. "We can't erase what we've done," he said. "But we can decide who we'll become." As he stepped down, their eyes met. There was no animosity, no hatred, just understanding. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of what she had done for him. After the event, Grayson approached her. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he admitted. "But I want to do something that matters. Something real." Ayanna studied him carefully. Could a man like him truly change? She wasn't sure. But she had always believed that justice should leave room for redemption. "Then prove it," she said simply. "Not to me, but to the people you hurt." Grayson nodded. "I will." And for the first time, Ayanna believed he meant it. Meanwhile, Ayanna's legal work continued to grow. She was invited to Washington, D.C. to help draft new policies that would hold police departments accountable nationwide. Standing in front of lawmakers, she spoke with the same fire that had carried her through every battle. "This isn't just about laws," she told them. "This is about lives. We have the power to change the future. The only question is, will we?" Her words sparked something. The policies she helped write became a blueprint for police reform across the country. The world was watching, and for once, it was listening. One day, Ayanna visited the young man who had lost his scholarship. He was now a law student, thriving in ways he never imagined possible. "I want to do what you do," he told her. "I want to fight for the people who don't have a voice." Ayanna smiled, pride swelling in her chest. "Then you will," she assured him. "And one day, you'll do it even better than I have." That was the beauty of change. It didn't just stop with one person. It rippled outward, touching lives, shaping futures. The next generation was ready to carry the torch. Months later, Ayanna attended a community event where families of victims shared their stories. One mother, who had lost her son to wrongful arrest, took the stage. "For years, I thought no one would ever care," she said, her voice trembling. "But today, I know that my son's name won't be forgotten. Because people like Ayanna Caldwell made sure of it." Ayanna felt tears prick her eyes. This was why she fought. Not for recognition. Not for revenge. But for people like this mother, who deserved to be seen, heard, and valued. That night, Ayanna walked through the city, reflecting on how much had changed. No longer did she feel the same fear that once gripped her when she was falsely arrested. The streets looked different now, filled with murals honoring those who had been wronged, filled with young activists determined to make a difference. The city was healing, and so was she. Justice wasn't just a courtroom victory. It was this: people finding hope where there was once only pain. It was proof that change, no matter how difficult, was always worth fighting for. As she stood beneath the city lights, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Grayson. "Thank you for making me see the truth. I won't waste it." She stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "Don't thank me. Just do better." She didn't know if he would, but she had hope. And sometimes, hope was enough. The next day, Ayanna was invited to a school to speak to young students about justice. As she spoke, she saw the light in their eyes, the fire in their hearts. They were listening. They were learning. And they were ready to make the world better than they found it. When the event ended, a little girl ran up to her. "I want to be just like you when I grow up," she said. Ayanna knelt, looking into the girl's hopeful eyes. "You're going to be even greater than me," she promised. "And I can't wait to see it." As Ayanna walked out of the school, she felt something deep in her heart: hope. The fight for justice had been long and exhausting, but it had not been in vain. She had spent years pushing against a system that tried to silence her, but now, she wasn't alone. There were young voices rising, ready to carry on the fight. She thought of the little girl who wanted to be like her. That was the legacy she wanted to leave behind, not just victories in the courtroom, but the belief that change was possible. And it was. Meanwhile, Grayson had begun the hardest journey of his life: redemption. He spent his time in prison not just reflecting but actively working to undo the harm he had caused. He wrote letters to those he had wronged, apologizing not just with words but with action. He joined programs that helped former officers understand the consequences of racial bias. He shared his story openly, admitting his past failures. Some people would never forgive him, and he understood that. But he wasn't doing this for forgiveness. He was doing it because he could no longer ignore the truth. 1 year later, Grayson was released on parole. He stepped out of prison, not as a police officer, not as the man he once was, but as someone who had been humbled by his mistakes. He had no badge, no authority, only the knowledge that he had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. He didn't return to law enforcement. Instead, he dedicated his time to helping young officers understand what he had once ignored. He became a voice of warning, telling them, "Don't become what I was. Be better." Ayanna heard about his work but didn't reach out. She had done her part. She had exposed the truth, fought for justice, and made sure he faced consequences. But deep inside, she wondered, was redemption truly possible for someone like him? Then one day, she received a letter. It was from Grayson. "I won't ask for your forgiveness," he wrote. "I don't deserve it. But I do want you to know this: you changed me. And because of you, I'm trying to make sure no one else suffers the way you did." Ayanna stared at the letter, overwhelmed. She folded the paper and placed it in a box filled with letters from people she had helped over the years. Each one was a reminder of why she fought. But this letter? It was different. It wasn't from a victim, but from a former oppressor. A man who had once used his power to destroy lives, now trying to rebuild them. She would never forget what he did to her. But maybe, just maybe, people could change. Not because they deserved a second chance, but because they chose to become better than they once were. Years passed, and Ayanna's impact continued to grow. She became a national figure in the fight for justice, her legal work shaping policies across the country. She helped exonerate the wrongly accused, fought for better policing practices, and mentored young lawyers who wanted to follow in her footsteps. But beyond all the titles, the awards, and the recognition, she was most proud of the lives she had touched. The mother who no longer feared for her son. The young man who reclaimed his future. The little girl who believed she could change the world. One evening, As Ayanna sat on her porch, watching the sunset, her phone buzzed. It was an invitation to a community event, one celebrating police reform and racial justice. She almost declined, exhausted from years of fighting. But then, she saw who had sent it. Grayson. He was organizing the event, bringing together former officers and community leaders to continue the conversation on justice and accountability. She hesitated. Could she really face him after everything? Then she remembered what she always told others. Change wasn't just about punishment. It was about transformation. And maybe, this was part of it. The night of the event, Ayanna arrived and found herself surrounded by familiar faces, people she had fought for, activists she had worked with, families who had suffered but never stopped hoping. And then she saw him. Grayson stood on stage, looking out at the crowd. I was once part of the problem, he admitted. But today, I want to be part of the solution. He stepped down, and for the first time, he met Ayanna's gaze. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no entitlement, just quiet gratitude. And for the first time, she nodded. A silent acknowledgement of change. After the event, Grayson approached her. I never expected you to come, he admitted. Ayanna folded her arms. Neither did I, she said honestly. There was a pause. I know I'll never undo what I did, Grayson continued. But I also know that my silence once allowed injustice to thrive. And I refuse to be silent anymore. Ayanna studied him carefully. He had changed. Not because he had been forced to, but because he had chosen to. Good, she finally said. Because the work isn't over. Grayson nodded. Then let's keep going. In that moment, Ayanna realized something. Justice wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making someone pay. It was about making sure that what happened to her, what happened to so many others, would never happen again. It was about making the world better, one person, one law, one fight at a time. She had started this journey alone, but now, she wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, fighters, believers. And together, they would continue to push for change. As she walked away, she felt lighter than she had in years. The past would always be there, a reminder of what she had endured. But the future? The future was hers to shape. And she was ready. Because justice wasn't just a battle. It was a legacy. And she was determined to leave behind a world where no one had to fight the way she once did. A world where justice wasn't a privilege, but a promise. And as the city lights shone around her, she knew she had already won. Thanks for watching. Please like, share and comments to encourage us to always create an original and life stories as this one. Hit the subscribe button for notifications.